discussing some of our favorite players for 2025 and dissecting one of Shawn Siegele's biggest ever articles on RotoViz.com. That is what we're going to talk about today on the show. Shawn, we're not going to dissect the article completely because it's 12,500 words long. So it's going to be a big one. It's for the Big Gorilla Blueprint. Shawn, you could have called this article itself the Big Gorilla. You could have come up with a name. Maybe that's why it's so big, but it covers all the tiers of your kind of rankings, looks at it round by round, shares some of the targets and some of the ways to play your drafts. So we are going to talk through that, but look as well at maybe the players that we haven't talked as much about. There won't be as much rookie conversation on this show. We've talked a lot about the rookies, obviously pre-draft, post-draft, looking at some of the veterans now on this one. Shawn, another week away from the NFL draft, another week closer to the NFL season. I think on Sunday, I've seen that it's only 16 Sundays to NFL week 1. So we are now less than 16 Sundays away from the start of the season. It will be here before we know it.
Colm, it's early to start it'll be here before you know it countdown, but it will.
There's two things, Shawn. There's the it'll be here before you know it countdown and the best time of the year for talking about fantasy football. They are the two things we can guarantee on this podcast.
And as part of that, we got the NFL schedule release last week. That won't be the focus of today's episode either, but it is, again, as you mentioned, a fun time of the fantasy season. Colm, you can play redraft over at the FFPC, the main event, the Big Gorilla. Colm, I believe you use the code 25 RotoViz, which you can think of that in terms of the year that it is to remember or the number of dollars you get off your first contest. If you are a new user over there, most of the folks in the OT universe have been stockpiling dollars, vouchers for contests that they have won. Colm, Best Ball, Dynasty, Redraft. We enjoy playing it all. It is all exciting, as you mentioned. Today, we are focusing on the redraft element of it. And if you want to get a sense of how these early contests are unfolding, you can go over to our FFPC redraft dashboard tool. Look at the ADP over there. Colm, that also helps us with a little bit of a foundation point for discussing the article. Now, the thing I want to mention is that this piece is kind of a combination of all of the big pieces that I run in August. And so it's not that we won't have those pieces in August, but I'm trying to set everyone up for how I'm seeing these contests immediately following the NFL draft. And to do that, we're looking at rankings, tiers. When you put that together with ADP, then obviously you get your priority targets. We discussed a little bit the tactics that you want to employ when you're going out and trying to win. Are we looking at it as zero RB? Are we looking at it as a more balanced contest this season? One of the things, Colm, that we talked a lot about last year is that we had these specific receiver targets who went from rounds 5 through 10, 11, what have you. And we knew we wanted to get Brock Bowers as the focal point of everything, but also we knew we wanted to get as much Trey McBride as we could. You and I actually went up and selected Trey McBride in the first round. So for us, the fact that he's going 11th overall this year isn't necessarily that much of a change. That's where we took him a season ago.
That's very true. And at the time, Shawn, there was some pushback. It may have been seen as outrageous, but he delivered on that. And you don't necessarily, want to say that on all picks. And it wasn't a huge jump, half a round to a couple of picks. But when you do take those stands, it's always good to see that, you weren't far off. When we look at the article, Shawn, this isn't actually as we record up and published on the website, but it will be, I'm sure, over if not the coming hours, the coming days. But it is the top 200 rankings, 11 tiers of the players, and then it's 43 priority targets, the complete game plan for drafting in the Big Gorilla. But that is also the case. If you read through this, if you're playing on any site in any format, you can take away the information and that Shawn Siegele is interested in these guys heading into the 2025 season. Shawn, tier 1, there's 3 players in it. Tier 2, there's a couple more names in it. What I'm going to say about these guys, there probably isn't a lot more left to talk about. They are, players we like, players we'll draft. And tier 1, you have Brock Bowers, Jamar Chase and Saquon Barkley. Tier 2 is Bijan Robinson, Jamar Gibbs, Jeanty, Neighbors, Jefferson, Nakua, CeeDee Lamb, Trey McBride, who you mentioned a moment ago. I really think, and over the course of the offseason, we're going to dive into these players multiple times over and over again. There's probably not a big need to dive into those players. We can probably like go to the next tier and beyond, unless there's somebody in particular you want to highlight from those two tiers, because we all know they're exceptional players. They're going in the first 15 picks and pretty much are all justified to be in that range.
Yeah, so those first 11 players are the first 11 guys. I don't have the exact same order as ADP, but one of the things that I do think is cool about 2025 is that the first round is deep enough to keep everyone more or less on the same footing going into the second round. One of the reasons, Colm, that you and I reached up for McBride last year is that you got to about 108 in the 2024 season. And then there were still solid picks to make. There were guys who hit, but there was a little bit of a tier break. Obviously, I have the tier break here after 11, but when you look at the next three guys, I don't think you can go that wrong there either. The next three players by ADP, potentially the next three players in my rankings are Amon-Ra St. Brown, Brian Thomas, and Christian McCaffrey in some order. If you get stuck with one of those guys with the 12th pick and then also get one of them probably coming back around to you at the 201, I might say probably coming back around. I mean, you making that selection as your double dip at the 1-2 turn, not a lot to complain about there.
When we get into tier 3 and beyond, and I'm not going to name out all the players. Of course, Shawn's put a lot of time into writing these 30,000 words. I'm going to keep increasing the amount of words, Shawn, each time, 12,500 words. But we do look at, I think, some of the players that I feel are standing out. And there is not names here that we have talked about that do stand out. But you get into this range where there's some more veterans potentially fitting in at the running back position, the likes of a CMC or a Jonathan Taylor, Derrick Henry. The player, Shawn, that stands out for me in this tier 3, and we talked already, we named Brock Bowers, we named Trey McBride, players we love. I think the key to the 2025 season could be a tight end, but it may be George Kittle. How excited are you and how optimistic are you heading into this season? Am I over enthusiastic? Am I double counting some of the information with Debo no longer there, with the evolution of that team over the last kind of 18 months? Interestingly enough, a side note on that, not really a side note, but the team did sign up Brock Purdy to an extension as well over the last week or so, the 49ers. But in this tier, is George Kittle the player that stands out for you as the possible game changer, or are you looking into a different name?
No, I think that's the right way to look at it. And even if you decide that he's not your priority target in this range, it is always the question when we play FFPC Best Ball and then in these big redraft contests is how you're going to attack the tight end position in FFPC with tight end premium. How are you going to attack it in tight end premium and other formats that you may play? Because the tight ends are going to be priced up, and yet they still, in many cases, are the league winning players. Colm, you look at our success last year, most of the teams had 2 out of the 3 of Trey McBride, George Kittle, and Brock Bowers. There were other strengths to those teams, but frankly, you can do a lot wrong if you have those 2 guys and they're scoring for you all season. Now, the question for 2025 is maybe more interesting and more complicated because Bowers is now so expensive. It's not just that he is in the Sam Laporta role, but he's in that top half of the first round as opposed to maybe being around the 1-2 turn or early in the second round. It goes without saying that the players have to score a lot more points to justify those prices than they had to justify the prices from last year. And I think although there were a lot of interesting opportunities at tight end, we don't have that one very, very obvious play this year like we had a season ago. You look at the rookies who were drafted really early and have that potential to be sort of poor man's Brock Bowers types of players, Tyler Warren, Colston Loveland. They both go into very poor situations for rookie production. That doesn't mean that they won't be good picks at their price. That doesn't mean they won't score, but they don't have that obvious nature to them that Bowers had a year ago. That brings us back to George Kittle. And when you look through Kittle's career, even with this perception that he doesn't draw targets the way that, say, a Travis Kelce might, the consistency of it is very, very impressive. And the consistency comes from a variety of things. One of the interesting notes when you go back and look over the recent passes, he scored 25 touchdowns over the last 3 seasons. He's someone who gets into the end zone for you. And that's perhaps a little bit different than the players he'll be competing with in Bowers, McBride, some of the guys who come before what I would say would be a tight end cliff. The other thing there is just extremely efficient as a yardage producer because he's so good before and after the catch.
Kittle, Shawn, fits into we talk about the running backs and the ways that they can score points and the paths to scoring points. George Kittle at the tight end position pretty much has all the paths.
He does. And kind of as you mentioned, sort of going in, there's this idea of the risk with him that he simply has to be extremely efficient to meet these prices. And I guess I wouldn't necessarily say that's completely the case. I do expect him to be efficient. I do think he has that possibility to draw more targets, which you alluded to with the elite players who are either gone or may not be with the team at the start of the season, what have you there. And yet, even with all of that target competition, he's someone who in the down seasons in tight end premium is scoring in that kind of 16 point per game range. In the up seasons, he's scoring in that 18 point per game range. Either of those will work at even this lofty price tag. If you hit in that 18 to the edge of 19 range, then you're going to be very well represented on the teams that finish in the top 100.
Yeah, I feel like at the moment he may be one of the most mispriced players in across formats in terms of looking here for redraft and best ball. Tier 4, Shawn, we moved down through it, has one of our favorites from last year, Jayden Daniels. I actually, speaking of the quarterbacks, Lamar Jackson is also in this tier for you. And when we look at, I did a show last week with Pat Corain, we talked about kind of the landscape of fantasy in general. And he was talking through elite quarterbacks and whether maybe with how things have changed and the way ADP is set up in 2025, maybe those elite quarterbacks are actual game changers where, in the past we may have been looking to fade them throughout the course of the season. But I would recommend people to check that out on the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show if they haven't already. I also will be talking on Tuesday to Pete Overzet for some of those shows, so be sure and check those out and subscribe over there. But Shawn, this is an interesting tier where there's quite a lot of the young players are going to pop up in the early tiers. But when we look through it, there's some with question marks, some with potential red flags, some with challenging quarterback situations, some like a Jayden Daniels where you're like, monster season as a rookie. Does that continue to take that leap in the second year? Does he follow? I know I throw this out sometimes. Does he follow that CJ Stroud sophomore slump? I think that there's enough there to say that Daniels doesn't, but until it happens, it's always still a possibility. In this tier of players, Shawn, that we haven't both discussed together very often, I'm interested to see what your thoughts are on him, is Lad McConkey, who obviously had a really strong rookie season and came on even more down the stretch. People will remember, particularly if they're playing the playoff contest, the massive playoff game that he had versus the Houston Texans. He's an intriguing player in this tier of wide receiver that includes A.J. Brown, Lad McConkey, Worthy, Tyreek Hill, JSN, Ted McMillan, Garrett Wilson. They all have kind of like running through them. Brown, you could say, like, do they need to pass the ball? And, how efficient they were last year. Do we get into that situation again this year? Worthy now has Rice in with him and other competition to go as well as that. Tyreek Hill, aging out potentially at this point, and the Dolphins having some offensive struggles with Tua being injured, but hopefully he can stay healthy this year. JSN, we know, changing quarterback, Cooper Kupp there, lots of change in Seattle. Ted McMillan coming in. We're hoping that he is an instant success in the NFL, but still there is a lot of adaptation to this level. And then Bryce Young, which is the real version, and then Garrett Wilson is now with Justin Fields. So it feels like out of all the environments, maybe McConkey's is the most consistent here as we move into 2025. What are your thoughts on him? He's not one of the names that are bold here as a prime target. That's why I'm interested in your thoughts on him here. Yeah,
it'll be interesting to kind of track this group. Because Colm, the area that you hit on is this area that's sort of end of the second into the middle of the third. And it's a wide receiver heavy group. And traditionally, I think we'd be very excited about trying to make sure we got a receiver or perhaps two here. Not that we don't have receivers later that I discussed, but even if you have a number of guys that you want to hit in rounds 5, 6, 7, 8, and it's going to be different in redraft than in certainly some other best ball contests that require a lot of the receivers early. The difference between a 2-2-2 format in the FFPC and a 3-2-1 format can be pretty dramatic. And yet we go back here and we look at these guys, and how comfortable are you paying the prices for an A.J. Brown when he's started to miss some games and you're in this passing offense that is simply not very high powered? How much are you willing to pay for Tyreek Hill coming off of the apocalyptic season a year ago? How much are you willing to pay for JSN when in many ways he's simply a more expensive version of the guys who are actually our targets later? How much are you willing to pay for a Garrett Wilson, knowing that he never really hit in the early seasons, even with the massive target volume, and now he's got yet a different suboptimal type of QB that he'll be catching passes from? You mentioned with McConkey that ability to have continuity and to have the elite QB. I think he's a fine pick. I have him ranked right around where his ADP is. I do think, though, we have to consider how unique some of the circumstances were at the end of last year. The fact that he is essentially competing with no one. And so the target numbers are going to be through the roof. You have some broken plays that go for long touchdowns. McConkey very clearly demonstrated sort of where he is. And yet the addition of multiple dynamic running back options, and especially Hampton, the rookie, the addition of Trey Harris to take some of the target pressure off, and then even the addition of guys that we really like and drafted a lot in dynasty leagues, Keandre Lambert-Smith, Oronde Gadsden late. I think that those players, and some people are going to be interested in mentioning Mike Williams. I don't think that he probably comes into play for me as much, although there's a possibility that he has some role. If he's playing, that probably actually helps McConkey. The offense in the passing attack should become even more efficient, but these targets, I think, will now be spread. And unlike a year ago, the Chargers are building into this elite rush type of offense where they can really push the opponent around. I would be concerned that pass volume and target share from McConkey, that neither of those things will be where you need to get the season that people are looking for without it being a great season, right? And so we think about that. You look at McConkey a decade from now, you go through his years, 2 or 3 of those, I think you're going to have extreme efficiency. And if you can pick those years out and say, these were the years he hit on touchdowns, these were the years where he broke some long touchdowns, these were the years where the catch rate was extremely high, then you go back and say he met the ADP expectations in those seasons. Generally speaking, I think that when we look at him in the future, his ADP will be lower simply because at that point, the overall context will be understood as not quite as favorable for him as what's necessary for his profile to score the requisite points to be this price.
Yeah, I'm very, very intrigued by him entering this season. And I think it could be one of those ones that if you do fade or do not draft, I think it could turn out to be a very, very wise decision if he stays at the floor. But it feels like he could be one of those that could tilt seasons in a certain direction if things all fall into place. What I want to get to on that tier now, Shawn, based on what we've discussed and what I mentioned there and teased with what I talked about with Pat, somebody you do have 9 spots ahead of ADP in terms of where they're ranked is Jayden Daniels. How are you feeling on the elite quarterback, specifically being Jayden Daniels? When we talk, it's probably a Jayden Daniels pick if we're going through those elite quarterbacks. You mentioned 2 unicorns in this tier with him and Lamar Jackson. Because it's that kind of area where the wide receivers maybe aren't as enthusiastic, and maybe if it's a case for your 2 targets in this tier at wide receiver 2 at running back and 1 at tight end, if they're gone or even if they're still available, how how much twitch is going to be in your finger to draft Jayden Daniels in this range?
Yeah, those quarterbacks are tantalizing, right? The quarterback position, I definitely think you can look at 2 different ways, especially in redraft, where there is less scarcity, because in its own way, best ball, right, is a 2 QB to 3 QB type of format. And so you're having those guys drafted, even though only one of them is being played. But because of the way the structure works, you need multiple players. In redraft, you're thinking of starting someone every week. And so once you get past the first 12, then the remaining guys really, really fall to the point where they are virtually free. And you can certainly cobble together an interesting quarterback position without spending anything. And at that point, you need these top guys not just to hit, but to absolutely destroy the rest of the quarterbacks for it to make sense because of what you are giving up. Having said that, I think that we look through the various teams on a yearly basis, and you certainly think about your teams that are loaded and that maybe have an extra guy or 2 each week that's making a difficult starting lineup decision. And you're thinking to yourself, well, if I simply took that guy out and had an elite QB in there, I have more points in the starting lineup. I don't have to make this difficult decision, et cetera, et cetera. The problem, of course, is that we don't necessarily know those things going in, and the extra player can be very helpful when you have injuries. It can be very helpful during the buys. It gives you an extra chance to have a player who could be not just your league winner, but the overall tournament winner on your roster. So it's definitely something where I think that question is going to be different for every fantasy manager, and is one of the most foundational questions you have to answer for the 2025 season. When I'm looking at this, I do see Daniels and Jackson as being a little bit different than Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, because their ability to hit these extreme seasons is going to be a little bit different. You think about the cast that has been put around Josh Allen, and it's not nearly as strong as the one that is around Lamar Jackson. And Lamar Jackson just simply has more upside from the dynamism that he brings too, right? We think about Jackson, and even though his numbers have bounced around a lot, he has a 30-point season. He has a 28-point season. The seasons that don't reach those levels are still very playable in that you're not selecting a Patrick Mahomes early and then getting like a QB 12 or QB 13 season. So from that perspective, you are more protected. We also think through it, and simply the context that's in place around Jackson right now is different from those seasons that are like 20 to 23 points per game, to where even if we didn't get as good a year as last year, you're thinking this is 25, 26. Whereas if you get a down season from Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts from a rushing touchdown perspective, and there are reasons to believe that we're going to start getting some down seasons from them in that department, then you're looking at seasons that don't really separate. With Jayden Daniels, we probably have that Lamar Jackson element. We might even have more from him. When you think about the trajectory last year, he has that rib injury midseason that sort of takes the shine off of the top end outcomes a little bit. He doesn't run as much. They play it a little bit more conservatively. And then you think in terms of him down the stretch. And once he fully sort of recovers from that, he averages 26 points per game, which again is a separating type of number. Over the last 5 weeks, he's at 32 points per game, a massively separating number. We think about how he played in the postseason, and there are structural things around Daniels that could improve, right? I'm a little skeptical of Deebo Samuel, but it does seem like a more talented roster around him. They, I believe, were the 3rd highest rush team on first down a season ago. They ran a ton of plays. They are a team that's pretty fast to the snap. They do know huddle. They were able to really sustain drives last year in the column. They had this insane 20 out of 23 conversion on fourth down.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's something that actually, goes back to normal a little bit more, even with Jayden Daniels. That's probably an unsustainable level. Now, we would expect them to be very efficient and effective on fourth down.
And aggressive.
On fourth down more.
Yeah.
So, these Commanders games, many weeks are going to feature them with the ball almost the entire game. That's very helpful for your QB. You're probably not going to get those 32 points per game that he averaged over the last 5. But when you're talking about someone with a 27 to 30 point per game range, that maybe still is the high end outcome, but it's a very achievable outcome. It's not like a 1 or 2% outcome. Then Daniels becomes a player that if you hit the slightest little bit of a flat spot, even though it's early. Yeah. As you mentioned, it's going to be hard not to pull the trigger there.
Yeah, and that makes it's going to be interesting, again, plugging that conversation with Pat, but that was kind of what we leaned into, is the players are not necessarily the same aspect in terms of what you want to be like hoping gets to you in some of those rounds, and Daniels does become interesting along with Jackson. Moving into tier 5, Shawn, and this is one that I think is quite interesting. I will say RJ Harvey is in here, but we're not going to talk about him. We've talked about enough about him, hyping him up over the last couple of weeks. Jerry Jeudy, though, Shawn, comes in as somebody who is, compared to the ADP, vastly higher ranked in this group of wide receivers. There's quite a few wide receivers in this. There's just one tight end, one quarterback, 4 running backs, the rest of them being at the wide receiver position. The other player that stood out for me was Breece Hall, who was much further down than we would have had him in previous years. We obviously talked a little bit there for a second about Garrett Wilson. Is this a case that we're kind of going to be fading those Jets throughout the 2025 season? And then I know he's your boy, but Jerry Jeudy, the quarterback carousel, we'll see who ends up being the starting quarterback in Cleveland. I'll let you talk about him, because obviously last season there was a hit, and I think that he falls into that kind of maybe mindset for people. I hinted at there with Bryce Young, and will it be a continuation? Was that the peak? Will it drop back to the norm a little bit? I think people might say, well, Jerry Jeudy, had quite a hot season, but it was one season in Cleveland. He was with Jameis Winston, and maybe he won't do it again. Shawn Siegele certainly thinks that he's going to do it again. So we'll talk about them. But Breece Hall, are you kind of fading the Jets so far?
Not exactly. Right. And I do try and continually emphasize how well DJ Moore and Colm played with Justin Fields in 2023. And there's the possibility that Garrett Wilson and Mason Taylor end up being almost the entire offense. And if the offense is efficient, with that being the case, then they could be fine. Maybe even very nice plays, because they are discounted with the understanding that you're simply not going to have the passing volume in a Justin Fields offense that you have in most other offenses. That can be counterbalanced by having a very concentrated target share and then effective pass plays when they do throw, right? So that possibility exists. My concern would be, as we think through how all of this is going to go, is that really does come back to Justin Fields, and he is almost certainly a target. The numbers for him suggest that even his somewhat enthusiastic ADP is probably too low. He will probably play well. He'll probably play better as a reality quarterback than people anticipate. But the rhetoric around the running back position is somewhat disconcerting from the perspective that you would kind of like to hear the Jets come out and make the claim for Breece Hall that what happened last year is that the team didn't really give him a chance, that the blocking was atrocious, that the play calling was suboptimal. You can come and do the thing that Sean Payton did when he took over the Broncos, where you simply throw the previous staff under the bus completely and say, I don't know what these guys were doing as NFL coaches. One of the kind of interesting things when we look at Hall and how bad the numbers were is that the numbers were also actually really terrible for another guy that we like in Braylon Allen, right? They were worse for him. And so when you think about these other players creating a committee, that part of it is still pretty tenuous from a talent perspective. If you fix the offense, which is going to be a necessary fact as you build out a successful team, right? It's going to fix in a way that elevates Breece Hall and makes him a star and probably still doesn't make the other guys a star. Now, having said that, I think it's important to note that even if it's a tiny sample, that Isaiah Davis was better than Braylon Allen. He was better than Braylon Allen as a prospect, and that is the guy that you probably want to bet on, in part because he is completely free. If you had a situation where Breece Hall was actually moved, then Isaiah Davis goes rocketing up boards, certainly even more from just a reality perspective of like what's he going to actually do as opposed to how the movement might go. Now they're going to both really move, but if Breece Hall did get traded, then Isaiah Davis would be the most, or like one of the 5 most important players to have in all of fantasy, right? So that's kind of how I would be thinking through this Jets rushing offense, that the stuff numbers, all of the peripherals for Hall and Allen were terrible last season. Isaiah Davis looks better. Isaiah Davis, probably other than Breece Hall, the guy who brings a lot of receiving value to the table. The thing that I keep coming back to with Breece Hall is simply that although it's a very different way of accomplishing it than, say, a Christian McCaffrey, he's probably the second best receiving back in the entire NFL. That's not going to be completely neutralized, but Colm, it's taken out of the equation so much when you have Justin Fields as your QB, to the point where if you're going to go that direction, you really should look into like, what can we get for Breece Hall? They probably have, and the answer was not enough. But this is just very unfortunate in terms of his career, the injury, the situation with Aaron Rodgers and the horrible coaching staff, and now the decision to go with Justin Fields. When we're taking someone who is a Jonathan Taylor plus type of back, and I mean, he's gone down this darkest timeline where it's more or less ruining his career.
It is, unfortunately. But, when we look back to last season, Shawn, he did actually start off the season pretty good. He had 2 really down weeks in week 3 and 4 where he had 3.8 and 6.7 points. But outside of that, the lowest scoring week he had was 18.3. So even with those 2 bad weeks in there, did average 17.4 points per game. But as the season went on, kind of really fell off a cliff from week 8 on, where instead of a huge game in week 11, 31.1 points, he had 18.2 points in week 18. But outside of those 2 games, the highest scoring week was 14, and quite a few of those being 10.5 or below. So it was kind of a mixture of seasons, but also the situation in New York last year seems to have been pretty toxic all around. The other player, Shawn, I asked for your thoughts on to finish up here today was your boy, Jerry Jeudy.
Yeah, I mean, Jeudy, second half of last season, averages almost 20 points per game. We've talked about him for years, how he has the great peripherals. You can go and look at his target location chart and see that he thrived at intermediate depths all over the field. He thrived at deep depths all over the field. He has that ability to get open. He can run after the catch. Catching has been a bit of an issue for him, but a little bit less of a problem last year. This is just an uncoverable wide receiver who shouldn't be available at the prices that he tends to demand, except for concerns that this offense will be as tragic as it was a season ago. And Colm, all you have to do to think about, both the pluses and minuses of this are to go and think through, what happened when they benched Jameis Winston, and you get that 4-point game in week 16 against Cincinnati, but he comes back out the next week against Miami and goes for over 20 points. Now, you combine those 2 weeks, 25 points over 2 doesn't get it done. But week 17 demonstrates a little bit of the upside, even with just a complete – you're not talking about a backup QB at that point. You're talking about someone who is a stretch to play in minor league football as the starting QB. That probably won't be the case in 2025. Right. It's easy to look at this QB situation, but again, it's very different than, say, the QB situation in New Orleans, With the Cleveland Browns, you have 4 guys, all of whom can probably play. Now, they wouldn't necessarily be exciting, but we've seen Joe Flacco do it before. Kenny Pickett, when he went in last season for Jalen Hurts, it almost gave the offense a little bit of a lift. Now, you wouldn't want him to be in the passing game, right? And that's not to say that Jalen Hurts was catastrophically bad or that Jalen Hurts wasn't a huge part of them dominating the playoffs, winning the Super Bowl. Jalen Hurts, great QB. Well, you know the problems they had been having in the passing game. I think it gave everybody a little bit of a mental break just to have Pickett in there during that time when Hurts was injured. The Pickett situation in Pittsburgh was awful. It will be better with this cast around him with the Cleveland Browns. I also think he's the least likely of the 4 to play very much. Dillon Gabriel, the guy that they drafted first of the 2 rookies, if he were 2 inches taller, would have been the first guy drafted. Right? Now, he's not 2 inches taller. He's in this range where he probably can't see very well, and we've watched that be a big issue for a lot of guys. And yet, when you think through the upside scenarios here, he can be Tua. Almost no one can be a Drew Brees, right? But this is a player who put up passing numbers that make all the rest of the guys from this class look bad. I would be pretty excited if we got to the fantasy football playoffs and Dillon Gabriel has played, say, 4 games and is now the guy who's going to be throwing to Jerry Jeudy in weeks 15, 16, 17. And then you have Sanders. And I think that at this point, in the position that they have kind of put him in, that if Sanders ends up being the guy over that stretch, he will have answered the questions. He will have proved the doubters wrong, at least to the extent that it's a viable play in those weeks. So from that perspective, yeah, I mean, if Jerry Jeudy were in an offense where you had a good QB, he'd be more expensive. It would balance out what you have now, which is a guy at a great price with some QB risk, but also some upside if the QBs end up not being an absolute sort of smoking ruin of a disaster. I guess I'm pretty optimistic that this offense is going to be okay. Dynamic probably comes down the line if ever, but I don't think we have maybe as much of an issue here as the conventional wisdom would indicate.
And that is the player we are going to finish up today's show on. We are going to have another podcast later this week, so make sure you subscribe to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get all those once they are available. I will be talking with Peter Overzet, as I teased earlier, on the RotoViz Fantasy Football podcast feed, so make sure you subscribe to that. Get those shows. I'm doing 2 shows a week there. Then myself and Shawn are linking up for these ones, so lots of content coming for you on RotoViz Radio. The Big Gorilla Blueprint, top 200 rankings, and 43 priority targets from Shawn Siegele will be up on rotoviz.com. It will be linked in the show notes, so do check that out. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on social media at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all his work, including this one, up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.